Welcome to This is What Democracy Sounds Like. I'm Kevin Prang. This program is a presentation of Metropolitan Congregations United. MCU is a community organization that brings together religious congregations, community groups, and individuals to work for a common purpose to create a better life for all residents of the St. Louis region. We work at the intersection of race, economy, political power, gender, and the structures of oppression that are work within us individually, within our organization, and within the community. We are working towards building people's control of the government, building community control of the economy, expanding the public sphere, and creating structural racial equity. Today, my guest is Jennifer Lohman of the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition. She's joining us today to update us on voting in Missouri. I do want to note that we are recording this on the afternoon of Friday, October 16th. Things could change between now and Election Day, but we want to give you some of the things that are changing and then also some encouragement of what to do and how to make sure that your vote counts in this election. So thanks for joining me again, Jennifer.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So we've had two court cases that have come about in the last week. So we'll talk about those. One of the cases was about the notary requirement on absentee ballots. Tell us about that lawsuit. What was it asking and what's happened in court? Where does it stand?
So there was a challenge to the notary requirement on absentee ballots and mail-in ballots in Missouri, which is something that's very rare in the United States. Missouri is one of the few states that requires notarization of the ballot envelope signature on absentee and mail-in ballots. The notary requirement was challenged in court, but last week the Missouri Supreme Court said that the notary requirement was acceptable under Missouri law, and so the notary requirement is still in force for all mail-in ballots and all absentee ballots that are requested using a non-health related reason. The only exemption from the notary requirement, which is already provided in statute, is that absentee ballots requested for a health-related reason don't require a notary. All other ballots do. And I should add that this is only when we're talking about ballots cast by mail. So it's an absentee by mail ballot or a mail-in ballot. If someone wants to vote absentee in person at the election authority, there's no notary requirement there. You're just going in and casting your vote as you would at a polling place, except that you're giving them your reason for voting absentee.
You're giving them your reason and you're bringing your identification of residency with you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you just whatever was normally that you would normally use as ID for voting is acceptable for voting absentee in person.
Okay. And so the result of that ruling is status quo?
Yes.
And if I also remember correctly, the judge specifically said that fear of COVID-19 was not an acceptable reason to avoid the notary. Is that kind of the gist of it?
It's a little more complicated than that. I mean, so our absentee voting excuses are predicated on what the voter expects to have happen. So if the voter expects to be confined due to illness or disability or a caregiver for someone who's confined for illness or disability, then that voter can vote absentee using that health-related excuse. Similarly, if a voter is over 65 or has one of any of the number of specific risk conditions, then they can use that excuse to vote absentee. But really, with respect to the confined due to illness excuse, that is what the voter personally expects. And so that's a very subjective measure. There are, election authorities maybe differ over how broadly they interpret that. But generally speaking, a lot of people have used that excuse.
Okay. So the second case involved how to return the mail-in ballots, which are different from absentee ballots in Missouri.
Yes.
So again, tell us about the case and where things stand right now.
So in that particular case, and this is what's kind of confusing, there was a ruling on, I think, a Friday afternoon that said, hey, you can turn your mail-in ballots in the same way you can turn your absentee ballots in. You can take them there in person. And then by the next morning, that ruling had been stayed, which means the ruling is kind of held off until they determine the case further, and that stay is still in place. So for all intents and purposes, nothing has changed about how you have to return your mail-in ballot, which is that you must return it by U.S. mail. Absentee ballots requested using an excuse can be turned in person at the election authority or at a satellite absentee voting location by the voter or a close relative. And
Okay.
that's a one-on-one return too, meaning that you don't just go up to the election authority and drop your absentee ballot off. You have to hand it to someone and go through a little process to turn it in. Just so everybody knows that it's not like driving it through and dropping it in a slot. You have to actually interact with someone to turn it in.
Okay. All right. So things are the way they were before, despite a preliminary ruling. Okay. That's good to know. Well, you brought up it needs to be a one-on-one exchange when you take an absentee ballot in. We see in a lot of other states is there are drop boxes. There are no drop boxes in Missouri, correct?
No, there are no drop boxes. There has been some confusion because there have been election authorities, and I think maybe Boone County is one of them, that made an arrangement with their local post office to put special postal collection boxes in convenient locations. And, people are kind of referring to those as drop boxes, but they're not drop boxes. They're actually U.S. mail collection sites. So, I know it sounds like a whole bunch of semantics, and I guess it really is, but they're semantics that matter in Missouri. So no drop boxes. When you are going to turn in your absentee ballot, you have to turn it in to a live person. And when you're returning your mail-in ballot, it's got to go in the mail. And it has to be the U.S. mail. Okay.
And so that does have to be U.S. mail, no FedEx, no UPS, nothing along those lines. What about the postage on that mail return? What is it, and can someone do something like a certified mail to make sure it gets there?
So that part I really don't want to opine on because I don't know for a 100% fact what that would be. I'm assuming that if it's U.S. mail, it's still fine, even if you add postage to it. But again, I really don't want to venture an opinion on something that is that rigidly interpreted. What I am going to say, though, is if you have one of those ballots and you're going to mail it back, do it now. It does take 7 to 10 days for even within the county for these ballots sometimes to get back to the election authority. And it must be in the hands of the election authority by 7 p.m. on election day, or it does not count. That said, if you find yourself short on time, if you're worried that your ballot isn't going to make it and you're afraid to try to mail it and have it not arrive, you do have the option of just holding on to that ballot and then take it in to a polling place on election day, turn it in, and they'll do something called spoiling the ballot. And then you can vote an entirely new ballot there at the polling place on election day. So you'd always have an option. And that's what I really want to emphasize to anybody in this whole process. If you have requested a ballot and it hasn't shown up, if you sent your ballot back and it's still marked as not received 2.5 or 3 weeks later, if you sent your ballot back and you don't think it's going to make it on time, you have options. So you should call 866-OUR-VOTE, which is the election protection hotline, to find out what those options are. But you do have them. You will always have the chance until 7 p.m. on election day, and later if you're already in line, I guess, you have the option to cast a valid ballot, even if something went wrong with your absentee or mail-in vote.
Okay. This is a good time to remind folks that it does have to be received by the election authority by the end of the day on election day, and it's not a postmark.
Right, exactly. It's a received by deadline. It's a strict received by deadline.
Okay. So let's also talk about absentee voting in person that is going on right now in both the city and the county.
Yes. And, absentee in person is great because you get all the benefits of voting absentee with substantially less hassle, and you get it all done in one visit. If you vote absentee in person, you do have to still give one of the 7 excuses for voting absentee, but you don't have to apply beforehand. And, you just walk in as part of the check-in process. They'll ask you to indicate which of the reasons you're using to vote absentee. And then you do that and go ahead and, vote as you really normally would in a polling place on election day. It's very efficient.
And then both the St. Louis City and St. Louis County have satellite locations this year.
Yes. So this is the first time the city's had satellite locations. Their satellite locations are already open. They opened on October 12th. So in the city, you can go down to the election board on Tucker. And if you want to vote with a purely paper ballot, you do need to still go to the election board on Tucker. But they also have 4 libraries, which are the main library branch, the Central West End Library, Julia Dent Library, and Booter Library. All have absentee satellite locations there where you can vote. The important thing to know, though, is they don't have the same operation hours as the election board on Tucker. They actually have a couple days every week where they're there until 7 o'clock. There will be a couple at all of the locations in the city and the county, the 2 Saturdays before the election, they'll be open for voting. So it's really, important to check the hours before you go, and also to know that there is an option at some of the libraries for voting in the evenings a couple nights a week. You just need to call and find out what those hours are. Now in the county, they will open their satellite voting locations on October 22nd. And those locations include the South County Government Center, the Mid-County Library in Clayton, the North County Recreational Complex, and the West County Government Center. So those are all places that you can cast an absentee ballot, and their hours are identical to the election board in St. Anne.
Okay, great. And just as a personal experience, my wife was able to go to the satellite location on Booter last night. Was in and out in like 10, 15 minutes, and it was really, really convenient. So it's really good to see our local communities offering this to our voters.
Oh, it's a fantastic thing because, the election boards are, maybe convenient for some, but for others, they're all the way across the county or in a completely different part of the city. And of course, in the city, with the election board being downtown, parking is always an issue. So it's much more convenient for folks to be able to go to one of the library satellite locations sometimes.
Okay, good. Now let's go back to if you've sent in your absentee ballot, mailed it in. What are your options on checking whether it's been received?
So, I know more about the county than any other jurisdiction, and I can say that in St. Louis County they have a ballot tracker. And if you follow your ballot tracker and it says received, when your ballot is marked received on that tracker, it means not only has it been received by the office, it means that it has been validated, meaning they've looked at it and they said, okay, there's no mistakes on this, so we're going to put it in the pile to be counted. That just means your ballot has not been rejected for deficiencies on the envelope. Similarly, if your ballot is marked not received, and it's marked not received, for quite some time after you sent it in, past the point where it should have been, in the at the election board, it's possible that your ballot was rejected because there was a mistake in filling out the statement on the ballot envelope or for some other reason. And in that case, you should definitely call to find out what your options are. If your ballot has been rejected, hopefully they will call you, and the county has made the commitment to call voters and let them know if there's something wrong with their ballot envelope. If that happens, your options are to go up to the election board to fix it, or to go to one of the satellite absentee voting locations and say, hey, my ballot's up at the county office. It was rejected. I need to fill out what's called a lost ballot affidavit. And then you do that, and you can go ahead and cast a regular absentee ballot at one of the satellite locations or at a polling place on election day.
Okay. And that activity of contacting voters if something is wrong, that is based on the local municipality of how much they want to do, correct?
Well, yes, it's based on the local election authority's discretion because they are not required by law to tell a voter if their ballot has been rejected for a defect on the ballot envelope. Meaning if the voter was supposed to have the envelope notarized and failed to do that, and the ballot gets rejected, the election authority does not have to tell you that that happened. St. Louis County is doing so in this election, as a courtesy to voters. I don't know about other jurisdictions, so I think that it's incumbent on voters, especially in jurisdictions outside St. Louis County, to track down, what's happened with their ballot personally and make sure that it was received and accepted.
Okay, great. I've been hearing about the processing of remote or absentee and mail-in and ballots in Missouri. Is there anything that happens with those ahead of time, or does everything wait until 7 o'clock on election day before those ballots are processed?
My understanding is that they can do some preliminary prep work in a few days before the election, meaning that they can take the ballots that were mailed in and start processing them for counting and tabulation a few days before the election. And that basically involves taking the ballots that have been validated, opening them and feeding them through the scanner. No results are tabulated until after the close of polls on election day. But because, they do have the ability to, all the ballots in the county now are scanned ballots, and most places have, electronically recorded voting in some fashion, whether that's through a scanner or an actual voting machine. Absentee ballots in Missouri, in terms of the local election authority, are usually the first results reported on election night. That's my understanding is the Secretary of State does not do that. So if you see returns from, say St. Louis County on the Secretary of State's website, they add the absentee ballots last. But if you look at the reporting on the St. Louis County reporting website, absentee ballots are up there first. That made for some interesting results watching in August rather, because people were looking at different places and saying, well, how is this even possible? And well, it was because the county's website reported the absentee results, whereas the Secretary of State was just strictly polling place results at that point.
And I would imagine an upside of requiring that absentee ballots are received by the end of the day on election day is that there are no trickle-in ballots in Missouri because of that hard, fast deadline, whereas in other states, it's a postmarked rule, and so those results will be coming in the days afterwards, correct?
Mostly, yes. For most, I don't want to speak for military or overseas ballots because those may be different, but those usually aren't like a huge percentage of ballots that come in the mail. So I'm not going to speak for those, but for regular old absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, yes. In Missouri, they're not going to trickle in. They're either there or they're not, and they're counted on election day.
Okay. At this point in this part of the election with voting taking place, are we seeing any irregularities yet in the absentee balloting process and the mail-in balloting process that is getting in the way of people casting their votes?
I wouldn't call it an irregularity, but I would call it, people are sometimes confused about the process and about what they're supposed to do because this is so different. It's a very different experience for most people. And it's actually a different experience for most election authorities who've never had to manage, mail voting on this scale before. It's quite different. And since so many people are voting absentee or by mail for the first time, I think one hurdle to the process is people really understanding what they're supposed to do and, how to fill out the ballot, putting it back in the envelope, filling out the statement on the envelope. And, and then there are things that come up like people are very concerned about their privacy. So occasionally folks will look at this return envelope for an absentee ballot and they'll mark out the return address and they'll mark out the barcodes, for privacy purposes. But wow, don't do that because that's how they validate your ballot when it comes back in. So please don't do that. But it's things like that people don't know and that can end up causing problems down the road.
So let's turn to election day a little bit. Are municipalities still looking for help on election day to be poll workers, or is that process just about closed out?
Well, the poll workers, definitely need to go through training. And also, every poll worker has to have a bipartisan counterpart. So sometimes the number of poll workers in, say, the city or the county is determined by the ratio they have of Democrats to Republicans with poll workers. On the other hand, they're also hiring people to do sort of like, completely nonpartisan tasks like being door greeters, handing out PPE, that type of thing. And I think that they're still looking for people in those positions. But, as you said, time is getting short. The opportunities for training are getting shorter. So if folks are interested, they should sign up really quickly. But if they don't want to commit to, being working at a polling place as a poll worker, the election protection effort is always looking for volunteers. We're trying to get 1,000 volunteers across the state of Missouri, and we're getting pretty close, but we still need folks. And if people want to do that, they can sign up at protectthevote.net. So that's protectthevote.net. And you can sign up to be an election protection volunteer. You can be a roving monitor, you can be a social media monitor, or you can be a polling place monitor where you're at a polling place standing, with the people who are handing out candidate flyers, and you're just there with the, the sign showing the 866 our vote number, making sure that people know that there is that resource if they have questions or problems about the process.
So describe a little bit more a couple of these other roles, such as the social media monitor.
Well, so the social media monitor role is a new one this year. And it's new and very much needed because disinformation and misinformation are a major threat to the process. They were in 2016 and 2018, and they are this year. And it's important that we have volunteers who are out there to fill two roles. The first role is assisting voters, where they see people talking about their experiences at a polling place or saying, oh my gosh, this happened to me, I don't even know what to do. Then the social media monitor can step in and say, hey, here's the number you can call, and and here's some resources that might help you. The other role of a social media monitor is to actively look for misinformation and disinformation and report it to election protection, which has staff trained to deal with that kind of thing and decide whether it requires intervention, messaging, however they want to deal with it. But it's super important to have individual volunteers on the ground doing that, because even though we can, as organizations, we can look at things from a high level and see things that are posted, public facing on social media. We can't get into everybody's next door or all the private groups there are on social media or see what people who have, closed Twitter accounts are saying. So having social media monitors out there looking at that whole other universe that's kind of not visible to the public is a great way to find folks who are having problems and help them, and also find out what they might be hearing that is causing problems on election day. And then, of course, we need younger folks to do platforms like TikTok that most of us don't know anything about, but I'm sure there's lots going on there that we should know about.
Maybe somebody will be dancing their problems while they're waiting in line.
And I think that those things do happen. So we definitely want younger folks. We're happy to have high school age and college age kids helping us with social media monitoring in particular, but with every other role as well. But with social media monitoring, I think that they can offer something that, we probably can't. They could teach us what to do.
What are the rules as far as the end of the day is concerned if somebody is in line at a polling place?
If you are in line by 7 p.m., and that's, when they shut the doors and, of the polling place and say, okay, it's 7 p.m., everyone who is in line at that time still gets to vote. So, but you have to stay in line. So once you're there, stay committed, stay in line. It doesn't matter if it takes until, 7 o'clock the next morning, you still have the right to vote. I hope that doesn't happen. I don't anticipate that it should happen anywhere in Missouri, hopefully. But, this is one of those elections that fewer polling places because of COVID, fewer poll workers. So there are going to be certain challenges that could lead to longer lines, but I hope that, that our systems are in place that can accommodate that so that we don't see some of the things we've seen happening in other states, which are just dreadful.
Okay. And then I know we talk about this every single time that we talk, but tell me again what voters need to have with them on Election Day. Let's make sure we're clear on what identification is needed and what is not needed.
So you can go to the Secretary of State's website to find a picture of this, and it's kind of, and there should be posters in polling places too showing the same thing, but you do not need a photo ID to vote. You can have a photo ID to vote. You can have your driver's license or passport or military ID. You can have a student ID from a Missouri college or university or trade school. Or you can have the little card that you get from the election authority. It's, like your voter card. As long as it's the one with your name on it, you can bring that in. Or you can even bring in a utility bill with your name and current address. So there's a whole gamut of things. Any piece of paper from the government with your name on it, any ID issued by an authority, such as your driver's license or student ID or military ID or passport, those are all perfectly acceptable. There is no situation in which you should be asked to provide a photo ID exclusively. And there's also no situation in which you should be asked to provide more than one form of ID. If all you need is one form of ID, and that's true whether it's your first time voting or, your 800th time voting, one form of ID.
Okay, great. And then another reminder, St. Louis County, specifically St. Louis County, no other jurisdiction, you do not have to be in the precinct that you live in order to vote, correct?
I would put it a little differently,
okay?
Because we do have precinct level voting in Missouri, meaning that you have to have the ballot for the address where you live. So you're voting on the right races, you're voting on your congressional district, your state rep, your state senator. But the nice thing is that St. Louis County has print-on-demand custom ballots. So when you go in and give them, your ID, check in, they print a ballot specifically for you and your address. And that can happen no matter where you are in the county. So in St. Louis County, you can vote at any polling place. You'll still get your ballot for your address and your precinct, but you can have that issued at any polling place in the county.
Okay, great. And as we wrap up, one more time, the contact information to get to volunteer, to report problems. What are those phone numbers and email addresses or web addresses again?
So to volunteer for election protection, please go to protectthevote.net. If you sign up there and you are in the St. Louis metro area, the first thing you'll probably get after getting an email from the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a follow-up email from me with a few extra questions specific to St. Louis. And then if you're a voter who needs help, you can call or text 866-OUR-VOTE. You can also open a live chat at 866ourvote.org. So there's several, so they have some new things this year. And I just saw today that Election Protection has Twitter DMs for voter help. So you can go to @866OurVote on Twitter and, get into their DMs and ask them a question. But they will answer any question, no matter how big or how small. I mean, anything from, wow, where's my polling place, to, oh my gosh, I moved after the voter registration deadline. What can I do? And by the way, you can still vote, but it is a little more complicated.
Okay, great. So thanks again, Jennifer, for joining us. And you are of the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition. To learn more about MCU, go to Metropolitan Congregations United's website at mcustlouis.org. Also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and events. If you want to participate with us, that's where you find our information. I'm Kevin Prang, and you've been listening to This Is What Democracy Sounds Like. Tune in again next time, and thank you for listening.